and that from their point of view, there is absolutely no other future ahead of us but a kind of authoritarian convergence of the military-industrial complex and the multinational corporations, creating a form of crisis management by which a kind of new elite, possibly a computer scientist elite, will use the crises to gain new control to manage society, to take over. And that Toynbee goes back to the Assyrian militarist state and shows that when a civilization runs out of its charisma and its impetus and its mythological vision, the disintegrating polity recollectivizes itself in the militaristic dictatorship. And he feels that a kind of Assyrian militarism on a planetary scale is what we're going to face. Heilbronner looks at it more in terms of the crisis over resources, the inadequacy of the nation-state system, a feeling that we're coming into a new age of global dark ages, and that there's a complete universal crisis of civilization, and that the future landscape is going to be one of opposites, of a kind of convergence, interlocking directorate of multinational corporations and powerful nation-state blocs, and the response of the ungovernable in the form of terror. And so that the landscape of the future would very likely, from Heilbronner's point of view, be a converging landscape of rational management and total control and irrational terror and revolution and chaos and darkness. So that their perspectives are totally bleak and feel that it's already almost too late. Jonas and I share a sense that maybe there is more to history and evolution than simple deterministic schemes. I know certainly as a historian that in 1968, having written one book on the Irish Revolution, it seemed to me that America was headed for a revolution and that civil war was absolutely inevitable. And anything that any historian could see on the models of civil war in other nations indicated that America was going to have civil war. Well, we averted a civil war, and somehow or other, the consciousness of looking at Kent State on television somehow changed us, and we moved aside and created more unpredictable forms of exploration, innovation, growth of consciousness, and even managed to go beyond Kent State, beyond a presidential crisis. So there is an aspect in which the future is totally unpredictable. And
welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. My name is Andy Libson. We're joined by Kenny Zepeda and Alex. And as you can see, we have a special guest who is not really that special anymore because you're always on our show, which is great. That's John Klyczek. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications. Share your favorite episode and jot down our information wherever you found this episode. You'll also notice that Eduardo is not here with us today. He is traveling to Mexico, and I think he's kind of recovering from that travel, so he couldn't join us today. And just to say, I call John Jake, but John Klyczek is the author of School Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education, and also a contributor to Unlimited Hangout. So welcome.
Yeah, always good to be here.
And you'll notice today, folks, that John or Jake and I are here in person. We're together. Jake has agreed to, I'm visiting my mom in Columbia, Missouri, or visiting my family. And Jake lives close in Chicago. And you visited your cousins that are also in Columbia?
Some in DeSoto, some in St. Charles.
Okay. Is that close by?
About an hour and a half.
Hour and a half, okay. But then he came here, and so we spent the 4th together because Independence Day is the most important day for us, American Independence Day. And we spent today together. So it's really great to have you here. Yeah. And be in person. And I'm curious if you want to share any thoughts about your experience with the Libson family.
Very good.
I told you I was going to put you on the spot. That's my question.
That's how you're going to put me on the spot. I thought you were going to put me on the spot about research. It's even worse than putting me on the spot. I got to.
So, because he met my mom, my brother, my nieces, nephew, and the only person he hasn't seen is my sister.
Yes, all very cool people, very welcoming, very kind, very generous. A lot of good conversation at dinner, and good working in the yard, digging some trenches, and what else did we do? Busted up.
I busted up a whole deck, and tore up a whole deck so they can put concrete down.
Yeah, my kind of folk, right? Rural and on a nice little plot of land here that supposedly I'm invited to when Armageddon.
If things get kind of crazy and there's a place to go, since we just said, here's the address. Try to get down here. Avoid the biker gangs and the nuclear fallout
and the chuds. So.
Anyway, I'm just glad you're visiting, and I'm glad to see you again in person. And it's been great to have you here. So today's episode is actually part 3, which we didn't intend to say to have, part 3 of our discussion about the Noosphere. And Jake had asked, he said he had listened to our episode 1, episode 2, and he was really intrigued by it. And he was like, hey, I want to talk about this. And so I was like, all right, we're going to go to Columbia together. Let's talk about it. And I know, Alex, you didn't get a chance to share your thoughts about the who will win document. So I think a lot of people were going to hear, and I know that we heard a lot from me and Kenny, and maybe even Eduardo last episode. So this really will be a chance for Jake, for you to share your thoughts about those documents, maybe some of the things you heard us say, what you agree with, what you disagree with. Other than really Alison, I think you're the only other person who I really want to hear what you have to say about this stuff. I'm not saying no one else, but you've been very important in me understanding technocratic takeover kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're going to do. It's part 3 of Noosphere, but really from the vantage point that you may not have heard either from Jake and Alex. So I guess we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Well, so the reason why I had contacted you was, I was listening to it, and I was thinking, I think you mentioned the Hubbard article at one point in the first episode.
1 second. Are you hearing him pretty well? Okay.
Okay. Am I mumbling? I do that sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was like, I called I think I texted first. Yeah, I don't remember. But I ended up talking on the phone, and I was like, well, did you pick up on the overlaps with the stuff in the Hubbard article? But also, did you pick up on the overlaps between these white papers and the most recent episode that we did on What's Left, where really it was only about a half of an episode, or what I intended to cover, which became a presentation when I went to Moldova, and I boiled it down. So that maybe we'll link that in the description, just kind of give you a concise overview. But so kind of what I wanted to do was, well, really, I just contacted you because I was like, I wanted to hear if you were aware of it, if you want to just kind of want to put them on your radar. And then you suggested, would you want to talk about it on a show? So the main things that there's a handful of subtext and context and overlap that I was going to touch on. So some of it has to do with the overlap with Barbara Marx Hubbard research I've done. Some of it has to do with what's called systems dynamics, or systems of systems, which relates to network-centric warfare, or net-centric warfare, or net warfare. And then there's a few people that pop up in the citations. Actually, Hubbard is cited in one of these white papers.
And you're talking about the RAND document.
Yeah, the 2 RAND documents. So in the Whose Story Wins, and then the other one is something like
the
Emergence of Noopolitik toward an American information strategy. So there's a few people that pop up in here that we had. It's hard to say if we touched on it in the episode or if we didn't get to that point, but we would have if we didn't. And it's in my Moldova presentations in another episode I did at another podcast. But William A. Owens, who is this guy that's in charge of he's one of the guys that came up, was the architects of revolutions in military affairs, and it relates to 4th generation warfare. But he was also instrumental in setting up the net-centric cyber warfare infrastructure. And then another guy that's pops up is Andrew Marshall, and he's just part of that milieu. And I won't go on, but these, I'd like to explicate kind of how all that fits together at some point as we kind of bounce around. That was my intentions for
Yeah, and Alex, I'll come back to you in a second. I would say the overall gist, particularly in the second by the second episode, and I think Kenny, you agreed with me on this. We agreed together that we ultimately assessed that this noopolitik and noosphere stuff we were saying was not taken seriously by the U.S. ruling class. Like that was one of the things that we had said based on our read of this document. And secondly, we were very critical of how this thing was written. We felt it was not a very honest assessment of what had happened in the last 20 years since they wrote their first document. So we were very critical of this thing. And I think you weren't. I don't think you take that same necessarily approach. And I guess I'll go to you, Alex, in terms of your thoughts. Were there? I don't know if you heard our second episode on the noosphere, but were there some thoughts that you'd want to share about that document? Whose story wins?
Well, as had kind of come out during our first episode, I had cheated a little bit and had read parts of Whose Story Wins before the first episode because I wasn't aware that we were only supposed to read the earlier version. And I wasn't really able to catch our second episode too much. I started maybe the first 15, 20 minutes, but it's been a very busy last couple of weeks for me. But in terms of things that I wanted to share about this second document in comparison to the first, I definitely want to highlight overall this feeling of I can see their tail in between their legs. I think they're being dishonest in their depiction of events, but in a way that actually is very telling of where they're at and where their position is at. As I stated before, I think this whole concept of the noosphere is one that's interesting to play with. And I think that because of network-based warfare, because of the way media and information is flowing in these days, I think it's very important to look at this field of study in general. But I do think our authors in particular and their vanguard of neoliberalism kind of approach, I think it's very telling, and that's kind of what I'm going to want to expand on during the rest of our conversation. And of course, I just want to hear what John has to say as well.
And I feel like you have a kind of a different take than maybe we because it sounds like Alex is similar to some of us, more critical of it. I'm not saying you don't have a criticism of it, but I actually think like these folks. I said that the U.S. ruling class doesn't take these two clowns seriously based on how they wrote their document. Like they might laugh at these people and they we're not listening to you. If you think this is how we're going to run the world, we're not listening to you. I feel like saying no, there's something really more here based on the connections that they're making, some of the people they talk about. That was my impression when I talked to you on the phone and when we've talked. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so if I understand y'all's position, mainly your critique is that if we take noopolitik and we bundle it into soft power, as a euphemism for soft power, and then versus realpolitik is hard power, right? This is sort of the dialectic that y'all have been discussing, and then your position or your interpretation, understanding is that that this Whose Story Wins, all this rhetoric about noopolitik and soft power isn't realistic, that hard power and realpolitik is the main instrument, and it's within that discrepancy that you think that the noopolitik people at Rand are not taken seriously, right?
I would modify that. For me, at least, that's not my entire position. I do agree with the rest that I think there's sort of a misassessment that they did, that they don't entirely fess up to the development of things and to the way that hard power has related to soft power. But I don't necessarily think that realpolitik is the rule of the land, as do. I mean, we haven't talked about this too much yet, not even like Andrew and I. But as far as from what I'm from what I'm hearing right now, I would have to say, like, no, I think that there's a much more elaborate story going on here, which is why I do indicate, like, I think there's a lot, like, we should be looking at this because there are some powerful forces going on in this world of soft power, in this world of information warfare. It's a topic that I care about a lot personally. So I guess I would just make that disclaimer that even though I agree on the sort of like, egotistical assessment of, I think they miscalculated, and I can read a little bit. Maybe I'm misreading, maybe I'm overreading, but I think I can read a little bit in this document, this sense of compensation, also the sense of desperation a little bit as well. But that's not to say that I think that they are totally ineffectual. That part of the posit is something that I'm not putting myself behind, I guess.
Kenny, I'm speaking more for myself. Do you want to say anything about where you're coming from?
I mean, I'm critical about the stuff they predicted in the first document and what has come about, in the last 25 years. And that is what I'm critical at. They're not honest, just like Alex is saying. And I also believe that there are factors, I think that, the systems of systems, information warfare and all this is true. And it's part of the equation. But ultimately, I come from the frame that thinks that realpolitik is what everything devolves into, it's so that, yes, they're going to try to, and I think to an extent, over the last 25 years, this noopolitik approach, like information warfare and all this stuff, has been at play, but it hasn't been effective. And what I see now with the current events, the way I read them, is that realpolitik is like showing its true, like its face, and that sort of noopolitik stuff was more of a facade to a degree, even though it still factors into, wielding power, is not the dominant dynamic at play that I see.
Yeah, well, so I think this also parallels. So the white papers and their emphasis on the shift to noopolitik and soft power, which means information warfare, which basically means psychological warfare. Right? This dovetails with what's called, as I mentioned, revolution in military affairs, and then particularly fourth generational and fifth generational warfare. In fourth generational warfare, this is where non-state actors become just as powerful or just as threatening as traditionally nation-state military powers, and the way that they become more of a force is because they are able to network using information communications technologies, right? So net-centric warfare sort of means two different things, right? It means at one level cyber war, right? Networks in terms of information networks or digital information networks, but it also means networks in terms of social groupings. And the way that you can psychologically manage or manipulate the group dynamics is through necessarily the data mining, social media, all the various devices that we have, developing psychological profiles, developing group dynamic profiles, and then using that to nudge people into basically complying with, their acquiescing towards the outcomes that you might otherwise attempt to get with realpolitik, with hard power. Last night we talked about basically to what extent does this that every system, even the democratic system, even a communal, collective, cooperative situation, ultimately holds water because it is enforceable by some sort of force, right? To sort of, right? I mean, in other words, hard power, right? Meaning everything's working as long as we're getting along, everybody agrees. But if somebody, right, sort of gets off of that, whatever negotiation we have, right, the recourse that we have to maintain the stability of the system, necessarily some kind of coercion, whether through physical kinetic action or some other method of coercion. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that the shift with RMAs moving into the 21st century and with fourth generational warfare, this dovetails with our episode on Mind War, Michael Aquino's Mind War. His whole thing was that psychological operations was always basically in a sort of a corollary or like a supplementary approach to the hard power stuff, to kinetic, military combat. And Michael Aquino in Mind War basically says, now it should be the other way around, right? And if you look at like
and when is Michael Aquino writing that? He's in the 70s?
No.
60s?
That's like that. This is he's writing Mind War. I think the book was in like 2010 or 2012 or something like that. The white paper is a little bit older than that, but Michael Aquino had been, he'd been in military for way longer than that. He was under Anton LaVey in the 70s and 80s and stuff. So
21st century, basically. Okay.
I was trying to find a doc that had the.
I interrupted. You can go ahead with your point.
Yeah. So, and this also sort of dovetails with something that there's a nice documentary called "The Minds of Men." Maybe we'll link it in the description. But it's about the Macy Cybernetics conferences, and the title is based on a quote that's in a UNESCO document, and I'm going to paraphrase, but it's pretty close, which is that since all wars begin in the minds of men, through whatever ideas, cultural, right, that wars therefore must be won in the minds of men. So all of this sort of shows the shift over at least 50 to 70 years towards moving from realpolitik to noopolitik, moving from hard power to moving to soft power, moving to kinetic action to cyber information warfare. Because, right, even if you dominate, let's say I go in militarily and I conquer and I dominate and I colonize, whatever, right? I have a target and I use traditional means of military. I've subjugated this territory and these people. But now, right, we need to necessarily still install we need to enculturate these people in a way where they acquiesce to our dominance, right? So I guess what I'm getting at here is that the two that always have been part of warfare, right? Mind war and kinetic war. And the shift, the emphasis on the noopolitik isn't just because they have the new technologies that might enable them to be more effective with soft power, but that the ultimate goal is to conquer the minds of men so that you don't have to keep knocking down, right? You don't have to keep clubbing the subordinates. You don't have to keep, right? At a certain point, true victory is when the target has submitted such, not just that they submit, but to use George Orwell's term, that you love Big Brother. You don't just submit to Big Brother; that you love it. And so that's how I see what you might see as a dichotomy. I actually see it as like two parts of a coin. And when we talk about the scenario planning documents, which is a RAND Corporation concept, where basically they have like 4 quadrants, right? And they have an ideal scenario that they want to get to, and they have a like worst case scenario, and then they've got these 2 intermediate scenarios. You can kind of take noopolitik in the ideal scenario, and you can worst case scenario, sort of all out World War III, nuclear war. Hard kinetic competition. And then, well, I don't want to keep going, but I could articulate what I think are the other nodes based on some other documents of video where some people from the cybernetics conferences are talking about future prospects of conscious evolution. But so I see them as 2 parts of the same thing, and I don't necessarily see that people look at these noopolitik guys as not realistic. Like, I just see them as their specialty is to focus on that particular scenario outcome. Whereas you have your realpolitik people at RAND Corporation, the military, that work on the hard power realpolitik, and these competing white papers are really they're just different routes that you can take, and they're non-linear. So it's not like, we're doing noopolitik. It's like, noopolitik's not working that well. We need to inject a little realpolitik. Realpolitik, that's a little too overboard. We need to bring back the soft power. And so for them, it's more of a recipe on they ultimately, I would say, don't really, to a certain extent, don't really care how they get there, right? Ideally, it's the one that requires the least amount of force. But if they have to, as long as they get their outcomes.
And when you say they, you mean the rulers who read these things and have to make decisions?
Military-industrial complex, basically, is what I would say. Yeah.
Alex, why don't you either respond or have your thoughts, because we heard a lot from me and Kenny last time.
Well, I do have to open up by saying that as far as what I'm hearing, I really can only agree and double with what I've heard so far in terms of the interconnectedness of the mind and the body when it comes to warfare or statescraft or anything like this. And it's always been my position that essentially the battle has always been mental, but that in the past, due to technological conditions, due to psychological conditions, you had to back it up with a lot of real resource material-based needs. But economic scales, industrial scales, information scales, they have all changed to a very significant degree. And even in some of the most remote places of the earth, people are being affected by this net that has been created. Usually it's indirectly. They might receive some print version of information out there. Many places have cellular internet access these days. It's something that almost every nation of the world has pushed, regardless of their supposed ideological position. At this point, they've all decided to buy in to this infrastructure. And it is a new type of realm into the human mind that has never existed before. My primary field of study is history, and I know that what we have today in terms of this new world that's being created, this new slice of life, and it's built on things that have always been there. I'm not trying to act as if it is a totally novel thing, but it is a configuration which has certainly never existed as far as we can tell, right? Unless there was some really crazy ancient alien type of, hyped out, scenario, Atlantis, who knows? But as far as I can tell, this is a novel thing in that way. And it is something that I think the military has been looking at for a very long time. And now I guess something that I want to emphasize is the way I see it, it isn't even just that it's a competition between soft power and hard power, Noopolitik and realpolitik. Because as far as I understand, the proponents of a realpolitik are the people who are invested in hard power. During the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because, I used to be a little bit of a military history nerd. I looked into the things that the Pentagon was doing at the time, some of the big, advancements that they were going through, the proposals for defense spending. They're frankly idiotic. They kind of lost the plot in general, I think. During the 90s especially, because of the reality of the end of the Cold War, this wasn't just a soft power reality. This was a hard power reality. The Russian market, all the Eastern markets had been opened up. The Asian markets had already been opened up in the prior decade or so through the rapprochement with China. Even the hard power people at that time, I think if you go back and read it, it's not like they were super presciently like, oh, we know exactly the way this new terrorism, nonlinear warfare is going to work. There was theory about it, but I mean, there's reasons why the imperial wars that are waged today have not been waged perfectly. And it's because theory and practice always have a little bit of a disconnect. That's just always going to happen. So I guess that's also something else I wanted to say. I don't think it's just that, the Noopolitik people, sometimes they're right, and the realpolitik people, sometimes they're right. It's just that they're both sometimes right and wrong about the different things that they're looking at. In terms of them being different branches of the same tree, of the military-industrial complex, of the web of control of states and state operators and non-state sort of, controllers as well. Yeah, of course, they're totally tied together. There's probably some competition at the bureaucratic level, but ultimately, I do think we have to consider them as parts of the same body for sure. And I think that's more deeply the thing that, especially for me, I see how, and obviously I have my certain bias for where I'm at, here in California. Everyone is so entrenched in the infrastructure of the internet and of information, the way, smart homes are a reality here. Everything is becoming this vision that they've had. So at the very least, we can say it isn't so much that the hard is determining the soft. Here in California, we're seeing lots of bubbles and pockets of the soft determining the hard. We have a certain amount of abundance, and they've turned it into this thing where, oh, just for the hell of it, everyone's invested in this thing, and people are really living their lives connected to this flow of information. I mean, there's a lot of psychological studies being done right now about people's sense of place changing. When people say the world has gotten smaller, this is actually kind of becoming a physical, findable thing in people's minds. People's sense of direction in one place has become totally minimized because they see it as a big map. Like their physical, when you test them out using blocks and things like this, people now are less in tune with the physical space around them. Things have become smaller. The definition is less. And that's showable, right? And these are ways in which this technological world, that has this soft existence, is also having a very hard effect on all of us, right? So that's the part where I'm not assured myself of this outcome where it's all just going to be World War III, because obviously, like in a hard war scenario, the information infrastructure kind of goes out the window. Eventually, it gets reduced to the point of things sort of working the way that they used to a certain degree, right? There's going to be more print. There's going to be more localized networks, because if there's a big war of any kind, even if it's not nuclear, it's going to be extremely detrimental to all of the digital infrastructure that has existed. That is a guarantee. But I don't think that that's necessarily the way it's going to go down. I know we see it everywhere, but they are trying to, thread the needle, I think. And I think the usage of Orwell is apropos. I mean, I have my own criticisms of Orwell as a leftist, but honestly, like I read 1984 when I was very young, and I've always appreciated this idea of linguistic control, this idea of mental domination, this subversion in a way. Again, I think we have to talk about, there are ideas that have existed in the past about sort of hacking into reality, understanding things. Things like the I Ching and Tao Te Ching are attempts at trying to weave through that. And in a lot of ways, the powers that be the way I see it, they've done a sort of shadow transformation of a lot of these techniques. And they themselves, there's to me, the way I would describe it, there's a jujitsu to the way that the powers that be redirect energy, like psychic energy. And when I say psychic, I'm not necessarily saying, oh, there's a way that I can read into your mind, but there is an effect. There is a realm created by the collective force of all the minds, of all the perceptions that are going on. Mass media would not have the effect that it has on people if there weren't the creation of some sort of mass brain in a way. Again, that's part of the idea of this noosphere. I think, again, while I might not agree with the particulars of the noosphere concept itself, it is a very important part of this search to try to describe something which I think is very much there. This interconnected network that we're sort of creating, but is also starting to create us in return. These are questions, they're very existential questions, deep questions that I think we need to start asking. And for me, I guess this is the final point that I'll touch for now. For me, as a revolutionary, as a person of the people, as someone who sees himself as a common man, someone who doesn't want to get secluded into halls of power, I'm supremely interested in ways of delivering this information to the people around me in a way that's palatable, that isn't going to lead to defeatism, and that's going to perhaps spark creativity in finding non-linear, you might say rhizomatic ways of dealing with this system, because I can see the possibility for the creation of a very elaborate Hall of Mirrors, a la 1984, for sure. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm stubborn, I guess. I'm married to this idea of realpolitik. And again, I don't disagree that all this information, all this stuff is doing something, right? Like to people, and I suspect there are some obviously market incentives. It's absolutely about control. Narrative creation is not new. I mean, it's in our foundational story, right, of nations and nation states and communities, and and so there is some sort of power wielded, right, through that, like through who creates some sort of narrative, to create purpose or understanding of some sort of thing. But the way I see it is, like, again, I come from a seeing capitalism, right, as this socioeconomic structure that governs our lives, and these things do play out in there. But at the end of the day, like when we reduce all these things, and again, it's not to say that this is not important. I don't know to what extent, like I do think it's getting more intense, this information warfare and the mediators of that stuff, right? Like what information we get, who we exchange information with, who gets to share that information, what's valid, what's not. That is getting more intense, and I do suspect there is the Chinese are doing that, the Russians are doing that, the Europeans are doing that, the Guatemalans are doing that, the United States are doing that, and there are some states. I do see states as a big factor because they are the coercive arm. They are the ultimate determinator. When all else fails, when like the narrative creation fails, it comes down to that, to me, in my worldview. And it's also, again, based on this market system stuff, right? Like, this is not about sharing. At the end of the day, in order to have these narratives of disinformation warfare, you need to mine some fucking place. You need to use a lot of water to mine that fucking place, to create chips and all this stuff. And so I am reducing, my argument to that, and so who dominates that? And yes, of course, they're trying to use soft power to a degree, obviously. But I mean, there's a reason, and we'll probably talk about it later. The Russians are influencing outcomes in the Sahel region in Africa, right? Because there is trade corridors, there is mining that is, that it will be necessary. Uranium comes into play, for French power, I guess, what do you call power determinism, like the ability to produce for the industrial capacity. So I reduce it back to that yes, so narratives are important, and that's their first attempt. And like they've been trying to do that to some degree over the last 25 years. I do believe that. But this is what we said about that last document, that they weren't honest in analyzing what has happened, because under all that bullshit, hard power has played an intense role. There's been a lot of death, a lot of, overthrows of governments, a lot of bombs have flown, a lot of people destroyed, even in, like corporations in Central America, that want to build some shit, they gotta hire some guy to go kill the people who are protesting or impeding the way of their progress or their mining and exploitation. So that's my frame, and I don't dismiss information narrative and the goals that they're trying to achieve, because I do think it's gonna get more intense, and discerning reality is harder than even now. Like it's hard, like even believing all the stories of the stuff that I'm hearing that's happening in Ukraine, right? Like, how do I know that all that is true? It's hard to know for sure, because we are, like you said, in boxes. We have been reduced, but I do think that has a limit. That stuff has a limit, and unless they're physically restraining us and like we're completely plugged, and I guess this is where my beliefs come in. I have to believe that there is some human shit that will that knows some of these things it doesn't feel right. That's another topic, but in essence, that's how I view it. That's why it comes back to force in militaries, and in some ways, I wonder too: is this why the U.S. is so behind against the Russian? In what I understand is happening, right? The Russian and Chinese militaries. And Jeff Strahl sent us a video where, some guy argues the difference in economies, right? That China and Russia are resource based, and the U.S. is financial. The U.S. in the West is a financial system, and guess who's winning an upper hand? If you believe, again, the story that we've been describing here, that China and the U.S. are eating the West lunch, and they are doing checkmate in so many ways. And so, in the U.S. is not just gonna be defeated or they might ramp up their narrative creation, but ultimately they have to occupy space. Ultimately, they have to take control of the resources they're losing control of. So it's the same for Europe and all the players in this system. And again, like, this is why I see realpolitik as more of what it devolves to. That's what I said earlier. What it ultimately devolves into.
Alex, you seem to want to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just need to make a quick remark back because there's a lot that I'm not going to be able to cover everything, Kenny, but I do want to say we're talking also though about Russia and China, two entities which wouldn't even exist if it weren't for the strong psychological draw of them as ideas. Because I want to say, like, especially with Russia, that was a place that was very disconnected for a very long time. There needn't have been in the development of humanity one Russia. That was a project that was achieved through what I would say is a soft power psychological desire that was implanted beginning in the Middle Ages and extending into the early modern period of we must create Russia. There is this Russia and it needs to be created. Similarly with China, there were a variety of different states that existed that warred with each other for many, many, many years. But if it hadn't been for their idea of the Middle Kingdom, the divine mandate, they would have never been able to unite the way that they have. Russia and China also, in their employment of statescraft, have always been known to play the psychological game supremely. So while I, of course, have to agree with you that they've played the physical game better, I also just want to reiterate they've played both games better. It isn't because they've chosen to prioritize the physical game. We're talking about masters of the mental game who are now back up to a physical level. Because let's not forget, China for many, many years had been devastated. Russia for many, many years has been devastated. Even though they've gone through economic ups and downs, they've at least created enough stability that they can flex all of their muscles, the brain being one of them. So I don't want us, I think in reduction, we can lose something that's essential. And I agree that everything was always going to return to this physical element. But what is the physical element creating? This is the idea of the dialectic. I think we have to put them on the same level. The physical element creates the mental element. It goes back into the physical. There's an interaction here. I don't want to lose out on it and a true in-depth analysis of this mental side by trying to say, well, at the end of the day, it's just going to be physical. I guess that, that's the main thing I want.
Back on. Go ahead.
Just real quick, just this idea again. I do concede there is a narrative creation done by every state, about the mythology, the myth of the nation, right? But I don't think that is really what mobilizes people. Even in China, they have to use coercion in order to mobilize people. Just like the pandemic did, right here. Yes, there was a degree of people, following orders and stuff, but they still, Lipson mentioned in the last episode, that ultimately they had to use force, to mandate people into doing things, and yes, I do think they're both, but again, I think you mentioned it right now, that it still comes back to the physical. At the end of the day, when all else fails, it's gonna come down to that. And I'm not saying this to neglect the Noopolitik. I just don't believe that it works in the way that they're describing in these documents.
And I'll try to be shorter, and then you can come back. Okay.
Yeah.
So I do want to go back to the document and what their claim is. Their claim is not we can figure out how to do a balance of soft power and hard power. And I recognize that you understand that the rulers who read this are going to take from different quadrants and figure out what works best. I know every ruling class would love to rule if they could just rule by soft power. And here's what these folks proposed in the Noosphere document in 1999 that they followed up with in 2000. They basically said that the history of the last 400 years has been a world ruled by realpolitik. The body leads the mind, right? And I agree with them, right? That's actually, if people who are Marxists, that's based underneath superstructure, body, actions before consciousness, that action leads before consciousness. These are Marxist ideas that actually, before you think, you do, and the thing that they're saying is because of something very new that's developing, things that we talked about, not just the Internet of Things, but the Internet of Bodies, the interconnection of information, that is an actual new thing. Narrative creation is not new. Winning hearts and minds is not new. Gutenberg, printing press, radio, TV, whatever, ideas. The Constitution was an idea that required hard power to make sure that the Articles of Confederacy, fuck you, Shays Rebellion, no way. We're going to come in and use the hammer of the state to do it. Our state was built on hard power, all right? And people think it was built by the Constitution. No, it was not. It was built by the hard power. The Constitution was a statement of, motherfucker, we're going to beat the shit out of you if you ever try to do that Shays Rebellion and stuff. That's how you have to understand the Constitution. All right, that's the best way to understand that document. Is not articles of the First and Second Amendment. That was the sell job. That's the narrative creation. That's their noosphere trying to convince people, oh, we're still giving you these things that are just legacies of the Articles of the Confederacy, but really we're going to come in with a state and smash heads if you try to do that again. And they did. And they established the basis for going in and manifest destiny. They said in the document, the manifest destiny, oh, soft power, here we come. This could be all wonderful. No, it was a hard power moment. All right. So these folks are claiming that there's a revolution now. They're claiming that the revolution, and it's the possibility of the US grasping onto this revolution because of the Internet of Bodies and because of this new thing. And because of that, they're saying, even if they put it in nice terms, they know who they're talking to. They're saying to them, you can rule by soft power. You can rule with controlling people's minds. All right. Now, if I wave my fairy wand and we had implants into each one of us, like already done, I actually believe it is possible. Like if you could literally control people's minds and make them do whatever the fuck you pleased from on top, and they know that that's what's developing. They are completely right in saying that the ability to surveil people is as it's never been before. We're all in your business in a way that we've never been able to do. Like the Gestapo from the former Soviet Union or ever would have been jealous if they could have had that. So they recognize that thing, and they claim in their document that means there's an inversion in this world, that the world is now inverted, soft power will rule. And they think that China and Russia are ruling by soft power. That is not the case. Hard power still rules. And that's interesting to me. If I hadn't seen what has happened this last 4 years, I would not have believed that the world has actually not fundamentally changed, actually. I guess that's what led to me. Led to me is like, that it has not fundamentally changed. So even their document 2020, I would have been like, I'm not sure this is accurate. But now if you take it to 2024 and you see that literally the US is attempting to rule by narrative creation, saying 500,000 Russian soldiers have died, 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died. The Russians are stuck with shovels and can only fight the war with shovels. All their weapons are gone. That was the narrative creation they attempted to do. And that democracy in Ukraine is attempting to hold on, and everyone wants to fight Russia. That's their narrative control. But then there's the reality. Then there's the actual destruction of your city as people go underground and fucking come up from out of the ground and fab 3,000 bombs that destroy the fuck out of people. All right. And you look at those cities and they look like World War II hellscapes. Right. And that's why Africa is falling right now. It's not if this had been averted, if the US plan had worked, Wagner wouldn't be in Africa taking all that shit from the United States right now. It would be the whole thing would tilt the other way. That's my presumption. And so that's why I say that this thing they've said about the noosphere was attempting to say there's a revolutionary change taking place. I think events have proven them wrong.
Well, who would you argue the Noopolitik is directed at? Is it directed at domestic populations underneath a particular military infrastructure, or is it directed at competing nation states, or both?
All of them. They were clear.
Is the approach the same in both? When you attempt Noopolitik to garner and galvanize nation states together versus just trying to galvanize disparate pockets of different demographics under your domestic control, I
would have guessed this. I don't think it's clear, but I would have guessed this. The infrastructure is the same because it's the noosphere developing. It's an actual physical thing that they say is developing. It's not just ideas, but a cyberspace infrastructure. But they would say the reason you have to develop a very thoughtful information strategy now to deal with your enemies, to deal with your allies, to deal with your population, to communicate with. And that's what they're saying. It's like they don't say what that strategy is. That's a critique I would have, but that's what they're saying. It's like you can rule this world a completely different way now, just with ideas. That's the claim.
Would it be under this model, is it possible that nation states could, and this is, I'm going to sort of paraphrase some of the language in I don't know which one of the two white papers it was. It might even been the swarming document that I was looking at, Swarming in the Future of Conflict. It was one of these. And basically, oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot where I was going with that. That's where we, what it entails is that I can see your stuff, but you can see my stuff, right? Like to have a network, right? To create a cybernetic system where you can see everything necessarily opens nodes where other people can see what you're doing, whether your friends or your foes, right? Okay. Right. So then just the participation in, let's say, we'll just start with competing cyber infrastructures that necessarily, we'll just start from a competitive realpolitik model that's implementing these things, and these two nation states have their separate networks, but necessarily overlap, and we can see each other. And within that dynamic, we're trying to fit, each nation state's trying to get the other to capitulate to whatever geopolitical ends they might have.
Yep.
But then at the same time, there's sort of this horizontal thing. Then you have this vertical thing where you're applying that infrastructure to your own domestic populations to keep them subordinate. So you have the horizontal sort of networking, and you have vertical networking. Even by, I don't know, lack of a better term, like osmosis, just the nature of these horizontal overlaps. Is it not impossible that rulers of nation states, something like the Five Eyes, right, in Europe, that basically have all these military intelligence organizations that share data? Is it not impossible, either, like I said, by osmosis, by default, or by intention, that the horizontal overlap is used to, hey, share information about how to more effectively control domestic populations? And if that's a phenomenon, does that thing over time evolve, to use their word, right? This is, I don't want to digress, but we should come back to this term, conscious evolution, that's used in a number of these documents. Is it possible that those systems evolve to where you end up with sort of the emerging stakeholder capitalist, public-private cyber infrastructure that by which you could use limited kinetic conflicts between nation states in the geopolitical physical realm as pressure valves to incentivize the galvanization of the domestic populations? In other words, right, that's why I asked you, do you think it's the same approach? Because what I surmise is that what they're really aiming at more of is creating I don't want to say noosphere, because that's actually really the metaphysical component of it. The cybernetics is an extension of it. So that the actual objective of Noopolitik is more about how to get the competing nation states, competing militaries, to sort of harmonize more than it is to get domestic populations to harmonize. They're two things happening at the same time, but I feel like if the horizontal on the top is achieved, then what goes on in the vertical it's almost like just a side effect, that the nature of further harmonization horizontally necessarily brings those domestic populations in harmony as well, but at the same time in subordination to the hierarchy. In other words, they use this phrase grand strategy, and this is what they call the system of systems. We'll just use my book. What's it? EdTech data mines individuals for thinking and feeling, cognitive behavior, emotional algorithms. You put them into groups, it's called group dynamics. So now you don't just have individual psychological profiles, but you have group dynamic profiles, so it could be religious, ethnic, age, gender, whatever, right? And then all the ways that those overlap. and then you take those profiles and you fit them into what's called systems dynamics. So systems dynamics has to do with mapping out like supply chains, population growth, school systems, healthcare systems, right? This is basically how does the infrastructure and the raw goods work as a system. And then systems of systems is basically the overarching cyber grid that can look at how the individual psychological profile fits into the group dynamic, how the group dynamic fits into the systems dynamic, and then from there, like these graphics that they show, you see this kind of looks like what's called a buckyball. So,
oh yeah, right.
Buckminster Fuller, if you've ever seen, it's also called the geodesic dome. It's a bunch of they're usually hexagons.
And this is the head picture on who will win on their second.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the graphic they use for whose story wins. But if you've ever seen them, it's basically a lattice of usually hexagons. I think they're usually hexagons, but I think you can use other certain triangles and things, and you can lattice them together into a dome. And the reason why and this is a big New Age thing, right? Buckminster Fuller was one of Barbara Marx Hubbard's mentors, and she talks about him all the time. I've written about it extensively. But the nature of the buckyball as like this feat, this revolutionary thing in architecture and engineering, is that as opposed to building a structure and you have like a couple pillars or posts and a ledger board, right? And you have all the weight sort of on, right, either a cornerstone or like a couple of corner posts or something. That the idea of the buckyball is all of the weight is equally distributed. Each of those nodes is built together in such a way that the weight is equally distributed. So now, theoretically, then, right now we're talking about a domicile. That means that if I push on one point in the node, that me pushing on that one point, that has that energy goes out evenly and equally throughout the rest of the structure. So now take the physical structure and turn it into an abstract net grid or net of psychological profiles and group profiles on a web. And through the systems of systems, you can go like, oh, we need to put pressure on this node here, right? And that pressure, maybe it could be, the conflict in Ukraine, or it could be lockdown, pandemic, COVID. I'm trying to avoid. You can edit that if you don't want to get to COVID strike or whatever.
Yes.
But, right? You can, and you can look at it and go, if we put pressure here at this point in time on this particular group or this particular, that it'll have this cascade effect where all these individuals and all these groups will more or less get pulled along with it. And so that is, that's kind of how I see cyber infrastructure engineering. And that's why I really think that what their main goal is, if we can get the military and industrial powers of, right, Russia, China, and the United States and Europe, right, the Atlanticist powers and the Eurasian powers, to integrate their networks enough and to get along enough that we could have a truly global system in which we could regulate, production, consumption, and population all together. And I think that what we're seeing right now, the sort of the cascade of kinetic war, but lockdowns and climate crisis, supply, all of these, I believe, are the pressure points on the systems of systems to get to ultimately, right? I feel like there will be an arc necessarily, but that all of this is going to ultimately feed into Noopolitik. That would be my guess, is what they aim for,
and the development of a noosphere that is the basis of the use of Noopolitik.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it might be useful to just so the whole idea, like, noosphere is like, okay, so the idea of Hubbard and what was the other guy? Teilhard de Chardin.
We talked about it in previous episodes.
Right. So you understand that it's a concept of that the universe has consciousness.
Yeah.
And that it created its sort of mini, sort of self-aware form of consciousness in the human mind, and that the human mind expresses its consciousness through science and technology, And so the artifact of the technology, the ICT, information communication, becomes this sort of idol, so to speak, right? This vehicle by which the consciousness of the universe gets transmitted through the human mind into this thing that now can create a feedback loop where it can actually monitor ideas and thoughts.
But the reason they talk about Noopolitik is because of they see the evolution of the noosphere. It is not, Noopolitik does not build noosphere. It is the newest development of this noosphere that is the basis for the possibility of using Noopolitik as a means of rule. So there is a that they start with that as foundational. I would say. I have a thought about that, but Alex, I want to go to you, and then I'll respond to what Alex you have thoughts about. Whatever you've just heard.
Well, I kind of want to return again to the question of what they are trying to claim and whether or not their claims are true. As you guys were talking, I think something that to me really jumped out, I went back into the document. They make this argument because it also kind of rings back into what I was saying about this creation of the national narratives. We were talking about that. At around page 40, right, they make this claim that Washington is failing at Noopolitik, right? And they say that a few decades ago, America seemed to be an empire of ideas, right? They go on to talk about how essentially there's no more unifying national myth here in America. And this is something which America's enemies have been able to achieve while America has not. So I can see kind of multiple ends to this. To Jake's point, I think that there is a lot of ways in which, America has tried to create a system. And I also think that there's ways in which America has failed in its own way to propagate belief. I mean, we do see a very united or disunited states these days. I mean, I think everyone knows it's in the air. The belief and the force behind people really wanting to fight for America, instead of the Cold War being, the next step and another leap forward into the future, it was actually kind of a false start into a deflation of the investment into the American idea. So I guess my question to everyone here is, did this deflation and this lack of belief in this American idea, is it down to solely this hard power, physical thing of America not being able to manage the economic situation or reality anymore, or the military situation or reality anymore? Or is it, to what extent is it down to a psychological failure to continue to progress? I guess that's something that I'd like to hear from everybody.
Well, you made me think, this idea of losing our tradition, losing our grand narrative, So my publisher, Chris Milligan, Trying Day Books, done many interviews where he's told the story. Dad was OSS, Office Strategic Services. He was also CIA later on, but he was OSS and then later CIA.
And OSS is the pre-thing before CIA.
Precursor to the CIA was what we had for our intelligence agency at the time. And so he told Chris once upon a time, one day, he's an adult at this point. He said, Dad comes in one day, and he's an old hippie. He's kind of like, I thought he was going to give me the drug talk. And instead he sits me down and he tells me that we're playing out a lose scenario in Vietnam. And then he tells the whole story. And this is how I got into Anthony Sutton's work and how we were funding both sides of wars. And that's a sort of a side note. But this idea, this concept that we played out a losing role, we were playing out a losing scenario in Vietnam, would fit very well with how and why we lost our national narrative, and possibly it was on purpose. And at that time, you also have the rise of the whole psychedelic kind of hippie movement. This is right after, mind you, 1950s is Rand Corporation set up in late 1940s. 1950, well, at the same time, late 40s, early 50s, you have the Macy Cybernetics conferences. This is where they came up with all the theoretical stuff about artificial intelligence today. They also studied the wasn't just studying like the feedback loop in computing and how you can track and trace information in data sets, but it was looking at how you could model you could model the human mind using the same algorithms, right? And so they would study what they call the conditioned reflex, and then basically the subconscious, right? They were looking at these two different aspects of the mind, and how could you mirror that with data feedback loops, and thereby how could you create a cybernetic system? This is all going on roughly 10 years, right, before sort of Vietnam sort of drags us into this place where it wasn't the first war that we really lost, but it was kind of the one that everybody remembers, of like the one that was the first time we really said it was a mistake. And this is also around the time you have something like the Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers, that's Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg, if you didn't know, worked for the Rand Corporation. Daniel Ellsberg is Barbara Marx Hubbard's brother-in-law. Okay, and Barbara Marx Hubbard's dad was good friends with Eisenhower. Eisenhower is the guy that's in charge when they're putting together planning, programming, and budgeting systems. Later on, scenario planning under Herman Kahn, and this sets the technological cybernetic groundwork for systems of systems, net-centric warfare. But at the same time, what you have is the rise of, for lack of the new age, the overlapping milieu of new age, hippie, kind of communal, fight the power, anti-war movement at the same time. And just lo and behold, you have people only a step or so removed from people like Hubbard and these people that were into what she called conscious evolution. That's a theosophical term. I should have brought it, I intended to. I have old theosophical books that use that phrase. Right, so when we're talking about conscious evolution, when her and Desjardins and Rand Corporation they're talking about theosophical stuff that's sort of at the core of a lot of this new age stuff, and so and they're connected to the very military-industrial complex that's creating this system. What I'm saying is that where we're at now is basically just sort of the culmination of that, and I speculate that somebody like Ellsberg is playing the other side of the dialectic, so that this is part of the Noopolitik, is to get people to, we talked about last night, I have a friend of mine, former deputy prime minister of Moldova, his name's Yuri Roshka, and he was telling the story about the fall of the Soviet Union, and I'm going to paraphrase roughly what he said. He did a UK column interview, maybe we'll link it so you can hear what he has to say about it. But basically, he indicated that as the Soviet Union fell, he said they didn't suffer as much persecution when they went to become independent from the Soviet Union, because and his understanding was that Gorbachev wanted it to dissolve. And he was happy to facilitate that, because they were moving into the next phase of, I guess you could call it Noopolitik, where they were going to merge closer into with the world order, with the Atlanticist power. So what I see in sort of what the Ellsbergs, the Pentagon Papers, that movement, and I don't want to put too much on a plate here, but I could suggest something similar with the Trump phenomenon as well. But it's this sort of taking public conscience, public consciousness, and directing it at the evils of the United States military industrial powers, only to sort of actually bring the East and the West closer together. And so to sort of, if you're trying to phase out a system, and you want people to go along with that, and you basically want to demolish the system, well, you get the Noopolitik approach would be to get the people that are actually going to end up being subjugated worse under the new system, is to get them to think that they are tearing down the oppressor's machinery, so that they think they're engaging in some kind of revolutionary act where they're liberating themselves, but actually all you're doing is doing the labor of demolishing the old system, because they don't need that anymore. They want to bring in this new synthesis, and this also dovetails with. I mean, again, I just probably put too much on the table, but Charlotte Iserbyt, mentor, worked for Reagan, parents, Skull and Bones, all that. People probably heard it. It's listen to your show enough, but there was the Reese Committee papers on tax exempt foundations, basically their un-American activities. And Norman Dodd was the chief investigator, and there was a Edward Griffin interview where you can hear him say this, but he told this to Charlotte privately. He's a lot of people that he talked to off record, but the quote is that when he met with Rowan Gaither, who was the president of the Ford Foundation, off record, that Rowan Gaither told him, all we're doing is following our charter directives, and that is to make a more comfortable merger between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so I just think all of this moves in that direction, and I just think I speculate that sort of this process of losing our narrative through the various examples that I kind of laid out is just sort of the mirror image of kind of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, only to really, just sort of revamp the oligarchy into something that's more amenable to a new system of global politics. That's my surmise.
Kenny, I want to go to you to see how you want to respond to any. And folks, there's a lot of stuff on the. So at this point, this is what our show is about, though. In part, it's like, what do you think in relation to anything anybody says? So Kenny gets to respond to pretty much any part of what gets said, and I'll come in and I have some thoughts, but there's way too much that's said here on all cases to like any. So I don't want to talk forever. So go ahead, Kenny.
I hope to stay coherent. But yeah, I mean, I no doubt think that there is intent, there is a need for the ruling classes of the world to develop these systems that, as you're describing them, Jake, and because they do need population control, they need narrative control. They've always done it. In my view, yes, of course, it's way more intense. It's way more specific. I do think they have trapped us in some sort of box, right? Like I agree that here we are, right? Like in the ideas world, in the whole like real world affecting change. That's out of the question. Even us as like revolutionaries, we know that's nowhere to be seen. Like. That is the reality. It's dead. More people are protesting to social media. I was that person, trying to show but then I realized it just goes into a void or like this sphere where it gets trapped in like use and misuse and manipulated, and that I have no control of it, and so I do think that as a believer of the working class, or at least workers, people who produce the real shit that we need to live, like to exist. We don't have power, and we are not aware of that power, and we have been trapped in these narratives. Even like what you were asking, the questions you were asking, Alex. This idea of the nation and the right and the left. That's a trap. We know that we talked about that here. I think to some extent you've talked about that exchange, Jake, before, and that goes nowhere. It basically traps people in the same system, where I think the difference, like you were talking about the systems of systems, Jake, and this potential of nation states like Russia and the U.S. and China, using the same system, right? Like or to kind of create a global system is what I understand, and that's where I see the difference. That's where I think that I don't see sharing as part of this system. I see that, especially in a capitalist system, it's about occupying markets and controlling resources in populations. I do think these systems are part of the equation, but they're not about sharing. They're about imposing their system over someone else. and again, bring it back to the whole thing about war and why I see the current events as evidence of the what's at play is not that sharing. Even though I do agree, like I see what you're saying, like this horizontal exchange, right? Like the exchange of the systems, if I understand correctly, like they develop something that is useful to everyone, just like imperialism did. I think that the mechanism of controlling and stuff, the people who rule are paying attention to what works and what doesn't. And so I do think what you're describing is correct. The only difference that I describe is that I don't think they're sharing. They're not going to share it. It's going to end up in a massive fist fight. I think that's where I would, disagree. And so yes, and then this whole polarization, again, just to reiterate, is a distraction, right? Like from seeing each other in effecting change in reality. We're just trapped in these sound boxes of nothing that produce no real change. And in fact, it produces the opposite, right? Despair and all the other stuff that is paralyzing.
Maybe I'll just say this about the Noosphere model. And you showed that picture, and it does show a net going across the entire globe, and that net they show is the infrastructure, the cyberspace infrastructure for the development of a noosphere, which is not noosphere is not. It's an idea. It's more a spirit when they're talking about it. It is a global brain. It is a circuit. We become part of a sort of a global circuitry that produces an overall brain. And then if you look at this picture, which I'll post, there's a second. Into space goes onto another network, and that goes into that's where that transition, that even that Jesuit priest is talking about that, and I think these folks are saying the same thing. Development of global brain leading to God, leading to some. They seem to believe that that's where things are headed. If that was the case, I think what they would have said is like, look, okay, currently in the year 2000, we have America blue, China yellow, Russia red. And we can use information to keep spread blue to South America, spread blue in this global network. Africa will become bluer. China will become green. Russia will become purple, because our influence of just ideas can allow us to become the determiner. And so when we press on a node in Washington, D.C., we know that that's going to affect Russia, not just their rulers, but their population, right? And here's the world we have now. Now you have a world of hard blue, and hard blue in Europe for two reasons, for hard power reasons, largely because they rely on the U.S. military and their nuclear weapons as a protector. And secondly, we had to bomb the fuck out of the Nord Stream pipeline to make sure that was a major event. It was a hard power event that assured that blue stayed in blue, United States. Blue is Europe for now. The population is obviously trying to push something. But what is China? China ain't green. China's yellow. And it's yellower than it's ever been right now in comparison to the blue. Same with Russia. Redder than it's ever been. And in fact, there's an orange happening over in Russia and China. And that's what's happening. And that's not what he was talking about. They were not talking about this, about these color things becoming separate. And largely, I think that what's happened that's happened as a result of the application of hard power, both in its success and its defeat. And now we're in a world that I just think is going to again be determined by the hard power events that take place, and even warfare is being affected by that. When you asked, what do you think is going to happen when everyone knows each other's business? That's exactly what's happening in Russia with this war. There's no arrow movements. Like, people were predicting that you were going to have massive tank moves this, massive things that way in Russia. And they were like, look, Russia's massing troops up in Belarus. They're going to fucking come down and swing down. Never. That's not how it works. It's grind. It's like a fucking tank of ISR things connected in space, things connected on the ground, because they know that They know that Ukraine and the United States knows everything about where they're. You don't move your things and then they don't know. They know. So when you start to move, it's slow. It's drones. It's grind. It's destroy. It's way more destructive than war is more destructive now because of all the information they have than it was, and this is conventional war, than it was in World War II, World War I. And so that's how information, ultimately, this information that we think of as really being used to communicate, these are all DARPA products. They knew that at the end of the day, this was information that was going to be determined on the battlefield. This was information. So when they data mine me, it's not about selling me something. It's about building their AI so they can possibly develop an AI that will defeat China in that war. Because if that doesn't happen, this is my claim. If they do not defeat China in that war, then the U.S. is no blue. They lose blue in Asia. They lose blue in South America. And then the blue gets swallowed down, and it's orange, orange, orange. And so that's not the new. They call that the dark noosphere, actually, the orange, orange, orange. But that's the world I think that's how I would describe the world, right or wrong. Alex, you haven't spoken in a while.
There's a lot to take in for sure. I think ultimately, from where I'm sitting in this very moment, Kenny, I do see a lot of your points about everything returning, that return to the physical being more big than the return to the mental, right? The return to the mental is a build up. The return to the physical is a crash down, right? It's a meeting a brick wall, right? Sure, you want to do this thing, but do you have the materials necessary for it? Or sure, you want to do this thing, but hundreds of thousands of people just got bombed, right? So there's going to be a disconnect there. I do think, as far as the power, Jake, that you were talking about when it comes to information warfare, creating false dichotomies or redirecting revolutionary energy into the edification of power structures, I think there's an argument to be made for it, but I don't believe that the majority of revolutions are manifestations of the desires of the people in power. At the end of the day, I think sometimes they make a calculated risk to ferment a revolution, but I think they make a risk anytime they ferment a revolution. A revolution is a chaotic moment. A revolution is a moment where it could go any way. I don't think that things are determinable to the level where, we're going to do this and it's going to sweep away the old system, and that's just going to allow us to do exactly what we want to do. Because at the end of the day, I also don't believe that the ruling class are united to that extent. They will always find a new way of dividing. I guess, again, I want to create this image of there's a push and pull of, these ideas. They'll start unifying. There was for many years this neoliberal kind of like we're all sort of the same, right? I mean, you see it a lot in the way like Facebook advertises, right? A lot of their images or figures in cartoons or even physical ads that they have of people, it kind of just becomes this grayish blob of like everyone is united, things are happening. Wow, isn't it so great? That exists and that is real. But at the end of the day, yeah, things are changing, and I do see it, and it's based on a physical need. People are hungry. People, things cost more. It's more hot. Your government is less able to take care of things. And when things are moving in places like Africa, like how you were saying before, Andrew, they're moving because of hard power realities, right? It's the pure exploitation of resources out there. All the psychological warfare being done is to enable that physical warfare that is happening. The physical warfare is still, I think, as far as I'm thinking about it, it is still prominent. To return to my original question of, do we think that the United States has lost its position due to a failure primarily of soft power or primarily of hard power? I mean, I'm still left with my belief that it is a matter of both, because I do sort of agree with the authors that there has been a failure to manage things internally. If there's always a desire to manage things internally, and I think our government can be shown, in comparison to other governments, to be less effective at that. That is potentially a good thing for those of us that want to create a change, a real effective change. But I think there is an argument to be made there. Does it mean that that's just the only reason? No, I mean, think like the economy did not become this infinite generation thing that they thought it was going to be in the 90s. You know, it doesn't work that way, right? We are not quite at the level scientifically where we can just print out everything that we want to print out, which is, I think, physically what would be necessary for there to be an age of pure informational warfare, which is what the Noosphere people ultimately want in a way, right? They kind of want this reality where everyone's sort of living in this digital marketplace. I think a lot about, like, Meta, that's what they call themselves, Facebook Meta, they have their whole idea of everyone living in the metasphere, right? This is a desire that they have. So to kind of conclude what I'm saying for now, I know that many of the people in power have this desire to create this noosphere where things are just being done, beyond nationality, beyond this, beyond that, right? We've abandoned everything. It's just your avatar and what resource mats you have and how you want to depict yourself. And, it's been deconstructed. That is a desire. But I hear Andy and Kenny when they say there's this other thing brewing right now that is due to more reasons than just what our authors are telling us. I do want to say that they are pointing to some things that are happening. But I guess now, like, where I'm standing right here in the conversation, I do hear a lot of what you guys said in response to sort of some of the things that I was even saying or Jacob been saying. So.
And I want you to respond, and then I have a question for you. I'm going to edit this part. I'm going to have a question for you that is related to the thing you were talking about. Your friend who heard for the OSS guy basically said, look, there was a lose scenario in Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsberg, like that whole notion that, in a sense, the U.S. planned a loss to make something else happen. I have a question for you about that I'm going to ask you. So if you don't want to respond to that part of it.
Well, here, this will segue probably. So okay. Just to respond, Alex, a couple of things was like, so we got going back to scenario planning. Like, I mean, hopefully I didn't sound like I was suggesting that it's sort of a linear, like, our cybernetics are so great that we can, coerce all of the global powers into having kumbaya sessions, right? Like, but that's the scenario part, right? I mean, so it's like this is ideal, this is worst case, and then in between are more or less desirable outcome. So if you look at something like so same time period that 70s, 80s, Barbara Marx Hubbard was involved in a Soviet-American dialogue or exchange. There was an Esalen Institute Soviet-American exchange program, right? So Hubbard being conscious evolutionary New Ager. By the way, I don't know if you remember, but the first piece I wrote on her at Unlimited Hangout focuses very much on her idea that she literally says that social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all this stuff is the nervous system of the collective human mind, that is the nervous system of the noosphere being expressed through our technology. So like this thing that they're talking about, like she has been saying it she died in, I think, 2019, and it was something that she just repeated almost every speech I could find of hers. All right, but she was in dialogue with the Soviets during, more or less peak of the Cold War. And then in the meantime, 10 years later in the 90s, William A. Owen, the architect of revolutions in military affairs, he was instrumental in the development of systems and net-centric warfare, all that stuff. He was also set up a bunch of telecommunications corporations in the 90s, some of them satellite-based. One of them was Amerilink, and he had attempted to get Huawei onto the Amerilink board or have some sort of partnership between Huawei and America. So I'm giving you two examples in which you have people that were in the part of the development of the noosphere or noetic conscious evolution, these new age ideas, and or net-centric warfare, the cybernetic nervous system of the noosphere, who were in dialogue with or were actively trying to collaborate with Russia and China. Right. So, I mean, like, you have an example of where they're at least making some kind of effort to potentially, right, get that horizontal exchange and to build that cybernetic harmony across. And so you can see that there are at least some efforts to do that. And, you know, in the ideal case scenario of Noopolitik, it ends where we all decide that, yeah, we'll wield this system. For like the robber barons, when they kind of figured out, like, hey, Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, if we stop trying to undercut each other and we price fix, and we can pretty much, right, instead of each of us trying to dominate the others, we can cut up the bank, three ways. And so, similar idea here with this, is that, hey, look, we can all really efficiently kind of manage all the plebes of society if we realize that, right, we kind of put aside certain differences, right, and we carve up through the Cold War. You get these third world countries, I get these third world countries, right, and maybe occasionally we might quibble over some disputed territory or something like that, but more or less the outcome they're looking for is that scenario. It may or may not be the case that turns out that way. It might be the case at any moment you're moving toward quadrant A. This is dependent on the cooperation or the participation of the other parties. At any time, they could cooperate more or they could cooperate less. And when that happens, then you move your PPBS, your budgeting resources and your planning systems. You move from that. Okay, we're moving into quadrant B. These are the things we need to leverage from here to steer it back to quadrant A and keep it away from quadrant D and so forth. So that's, so I don't mean to, I didn't mean to imply that I think that, like, there's the oligarchs of the superpowers are sitting around smoking cigars, like, high-fiving. I don't mean that, but I do mean that. By the way, there's a European branch of the Rand Corporation, meaning it's not only interested in American hegemony. It's maybe interested in Atlanticist hegemony, right? The combined powers of the United States and Europe. But that in and of itself suggests something that the U.S.'s role as just one block in the globe is not that important to Noopolitik, right? It's not that we need to be the ones that dominate it. It just needs to be that, right, we need to merge or synthesize the U.S. cyber infrastructure as most efficiently as possible with these other nations that we were instrumental in helping to build up. I've said it many times you've got Anthony Sutton's Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. It's a 3-volume series. He wrote it at the Hoover Institution. He's, academic tome. It's not a conspiracy theorist that we helped build up the Soviet Union. And you know the same thing with opening up relations with China, with Nixon and Kissinger and Rockefeller. You can go back to the Rockefeller Foundation's first annual reports in 1914, I believe it was. One of the first things they set up was the China Medical Board, which is still there today. So, both of these nations, we have a long history of building them up to hopefully integrate them into our global system. At any point, somebody that comes to power may or may decide, no, we want to be our own thing. And, at that point, they don't want to move towards quadrant A, right? And so, but this is all of this is mutable from one moment to another. And I was going to end with a question, but you wanted to ask me a question. But what I'll just ask it rhetorically. Like, have y'all ever seen? I think you've seen Watchmen. I think we talked about it. Have y'all ever seen Watchmen? Alex, you ever seen Watchmen? It
was a comic book.
It was a comic book, right? No, I know. And the ending is pretty much the same in the comic book, but except one is like I think it's like Cthulhu thing, and the other one is like
Right.
the nuke or something.
Nukes, yeah.
So at the end of that, right? At the end, we'll just go with the movie because more people are probably familiar with the movie. Listen, so at the end, there's a nuke, hard power. But the nuke, the purpose of the nuke was to do what?
Get everyone to say, we're so frightened of this, we've got to fucking let our shit down, and we've got to come together. It's like what these guys want this.
Even was it Dr. Manhattan is his name? He pretty much represents God if you think about it. He's like that national narrative you're talking about, like, you know, that he was like the icon of America's a great power, and he literally could, you know, fly and shoot, you know, he represents the moral compass and the omnipotence and the omnibenevolence of the trope of it, right? And they get even him to go, oh no, this is good. I have to talk. It's better that we go along with the
lie.
Right. So my question is that hard power or soft power? It's as hard power as you could get, but the main point of it wasn't to blow stuff up. It was the mind war. Mm-hmm. So even in that, I know it's a movie, but I'm just saying, yes, in the most extreme, and the reason it's an apt analogy though, because my hermeneutics, the way I look at the development of what's looking like it could be coming close to Third World War, I don't think it's impossible that scenario, and I'm not saying we're going to control the outcome, like you said. I mean, if you foment a revolution thinking that, hey, they'll topple this thing for us and then we'll clean it up later, you run a risk, right? Same thing, like you think you're going to have a limited kinetic action, and then afterwards everybody be scared, and then we'll have our utopia. You run the risk that it gets carried away, and you know nobody wants. Side A, B, or C decides, no, we ain't done yet, you know, like, so, but I don't think we've talked about that. I mean, I know we've talked about it, you know, not on episodes we talked about it, but that could be, right, that what you are seeing as these escalations in real politics could actually be the main outcome is the mind war, is the psyop, is the Noopolitik. It's not that we're going to blow everything up and dominate. We're going to blow everything up and scare everybody, and mind screw everybody so bad that they're like, yes, plug the chip in my head. I don't ever want to see a war like that again. You know, that's highly speculative there. But I mean, I don't think it's so crazy that I wouldn't say it.
There's a historic evidence of using disasters, for creating disasters and lying about them to move people in a particular direction. Whether it be 9/11, the Lusitania, World War I, you know. So anyway, I think maybe we'll end on his question because I'd like to maybe do that. So I think it's an interesting question that we go from Watchmen, and I'm going to save my Daniels Ellsberg question for another time because I think we could have a discussion all about that later. So Kenny, you get the Watchmen question. What are your thoughts on that? Was it hard power or soft power?
If a tree falls in the forest and no one's
no, I actually think it's a good question to kind of give people it's a Rorschach test, you know, to see how you view these things. Because that was a tricky one. You got me unfocused. But I think I have an answer to it. But, okay. You know.
I don't have an answer. I want to hear yours, but I do see a scenario when I comment on that, you know, cataclysm, right, type of, you know, we've talked on the show, you brought it up, Lipson, that, you know, blowing a city in Europe, blowing up a city in the West Coast, because I do think that in order for, like in the US, right, like as much as we are trapped in these echo chambers, I don't think there's motivation for people to go fight in the name of the, you know, the American project, right? And so they're going to need to have an event like that, you know, of sorts to galvanize people. So that's the shit that like scares the fuck out of me, you know, to one scenario, you know, like, and obviously the other scenario is just all out nuclear war, you know, that is the worst case scenario. But I do see actually, I mean, because again, I do see this question, right, of like the mind and conquering the mind, and they have to, they, to a degree, it's part of the equation. But what they can't, they're gonna conscript your ass like they're doing in Ukraine. Like the people who are trying to flee the soul, they're just throwing them on the fucking, to the meat grinder. That's what I think ends up happening at the end of the day, when like the narratives and the, don't work anymore. And so, yeah, I mean, like, what I'm afraid of is of this competitive process, because I'm just talking about scenarios. There is shit we can't even imagine, like that could happen. But what I do see is nation states that are trying to control their own population so they can go to war, they can expand markets, they can, get control of resources. And so, yes, the narrative creation will always be there. But I think the people who actually wield power, they don't operate on these like, eclectic, like fucking obscure or new age ideas. I think they operate on fucking brutality. They're the highest expressions of psychopathic and sociopathic behavior there is. Where, and not just in America, in Russia and China, everywhere. And so that's what we're facing. And yes, we're being worked. We're being our minds were being bombarded with things, and that deflect from the reality. And I mean, I think that's the lesson, because like I said it on one show that that where I quoted Alison, and I talked about you too, like, and I sort of said that the answers have to be simpler, right, to some degree, because when we get lost in their narratives, like, I think we've lost the game. Like when we're staying in that echo chamber, in whatever we do, and we've all talked about it, it's gonna have to move into action. Like, that is what's gonna change things, and where we learn those lessons. And so, yes, it's important to pay attention to these, machineries of all sorts they're concocting to again herd people into whatever ends each ruling class has. We do have to pay attention to that, but I'm also like cautious of getting lost in that, because we have to do real shit. That where we've had conversations about trusting what people do, right? Like the reason I trust you guys is because you're what you say, right? But the next level of trust will be what you do, right? That's what happened during the pandemic, right? There were people who I trusted because of what they said, but when shit came down, they did something completely different. And so, yeah, I mean, that's like, those are my thoughts. I don't know how to process that question about the movie. I had to watch it again, but yeah.
I'm gonna give my answer, and then Alex, maybe you have some final comments, and then we'll let you finish up, things like that. So I want to come to the Watchmen question.
Checkmate.
I know, exactly. Motherfucker. Go home. Go to Chicago. The use of the Cthulhu figure that kills millions in New York, the use of the nuclear weapon. So in the comic book or the movie, that's hard power. I completely agree. What did Ozymandias say? Hard power event, but guess what? I'm going to use a soft power approach to use this to unite the entire globe, and billions of us won't die now, because that's the fear, right? He was afraid that billions. He's a superhero. I'm willing to kill millions to save billions. Then the trip here is he the villain or the hero? And Dr. Manhattan knows the game. The Owl knows the game. Silk Spectre knows the game. And they're like, all right, we're going to have to, if we don't go with the lie, then these millions of people died for no purpose, because it looks like it's uniting people. And what does Rorschach say? He goes, fuck off. I'm going to go back there and tell them what happened. And Manhattan has to be, I'm going to blow your fucking, I kill you. Yeah. One more pile, one more body. And Rorschach, as he says, are you going to put one more body? And they go, yeah, we're putting one more body. Hard power solution to that one, right? But I want to end this on this thing, because somebody says, Ozymandias asks Dr. Manhattan a question. Does it look like things are settled now? And he goes, nothing's ever settled. So what's the final scene in the movie and the final scene in the book is Rorschach's journal that reveals that this fucking lie is a lie. And this and one of these like right-wing front person is going to publish it, right? Which, look, you can say then, okay, then the PSYOP comes and goes and get that, but it reveals how intangible soft power solutions are, how those can be unraveled because it's built on just an idea of a lie. That ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're really going to rule, if Ozymandias really wants peace, he's going to have to. I would say that's the lesson. He's going to have to bring hard power is going to come to play no matter what. So you kill these millions, still not going to do it. You're going to have to kill billions, and that's what I do believe the United States scenario planners who want to win this war for the United States, I believe, understand we will be killing billions to win. We're not just blowing up Russia. We're not just blowing up.
Well, that's what Barbara Marx Hubbard said.
I
need to call 1/4 of the human population.
Okay, well, she was wrong. They meant she should have said 3/4.
No,
she was being too optimistic. She should have said 3/4. But that they know that they're not just going to destroy China and Russia. That they're going to destroy India and Brazil because they know that they have to leave it so that no one else on the globe can compete with them and they can emerge from their bunkers and just rule. So that's my answer on that. More about the Watchmen, because I want to nerd out on that. That's good. But Alex, go ahead.
Well, I guess the main thing that I want to leave it on is the thought that's taking over my head right now, because it is my pet subject anyway, is this idea of World War I, right? Because this, especially to go back a little bit to your comments about how the war in Ukraine is even more brutal and slow and slogging, right? This war of movement that was posited is not the fact of technology. And that was actually the case in World War I. The fact of technology was the slowdown of everything. And then we have to remember that the Second World War was essentially a figuring out mentally enough of that physical reality that had been created to have a different type of war. To go to some of what Jake is suggesting, there is an argument to be made that both of those wars were formulated, right? Especially the First World War, and in many ways, the Second World War is just kind of a natural consequence. I, as a historian, very much de-emphasize the impact of the Second World War on the development of humanity. I would prefer to focus on the First World War because it seems one in which things were much more fluid. The potential for a different outcome was much greater because people were rising up irrespective of what the common narrative was. But if you want to see it, Versailles and everything like that, that was the victory of those who were willing to push that button of let's have this war and in order to create our new order that we want to create. That the League of Nations, everything that happened and now into the United Nations, that story happened there. That was that critical moment to me where they did push that button and the bet worked for them. They were willing to sacrifice all of those people, and it happened. The Second World War was just a continuing of playing out of all the things, right? If the Nazis would have won that war, they just would have been a bigger part of the overall plan of these Western capitalist imperialists. Like in a way, the way I see the Second World War is the West deciding to see who was more likely to last longer, whether it was the Nazis or the Soviets, and the Soviets ended up winning out by a hair. And so that's when they decided, okay, well, we'll get into this fight as well, because before that they had every reason to ally with Hitler. Hitler was, at least with the UK, he thought it was very realistic, and I'm sure there were many versions of French governments that would have at least tried to work with the Third Reich. So those things are scary to think about for sure. But again, I do return to this idea that we, the people, need to recognize the risks that they are taking. We cannot play into the narrative of, well, you have to do this. Like, in these wars that are coming and are happening, our answer must be a strong and simple no, right? We must refuse to be engaged in any war which is being waged by states or their non-state allies, right? The only war is is the people's defensive war. When the state comes after us inevitably, as they always are, if we are successful in our attempts to build a movement, they will resort to hard power. What our argument is that the soft power will be ineffective. The difficult part that we have to square is that the hard power will come into effect. The state does have a wealth of resources. But to me, I mean, the reason I'm so obsessed on the First World War is because as a historian, I see how it could have gone just a little different and the story would have been very, very different. We could have seen the end of the global financial market. The First World War could have been it had a hard time adjusting even after its ideal outcome, right? If you want to look at it from those perspectives, right? The financiers made it happen on a certain level, the First World War. But I think the Great Depression was a real thing. I think it was an inevitable part of, well, they took out this big risk and it still shocked them. If things had gone different, I think the world financial system could have been gone. All of those banks, the Swiss this, the Dutch that, the English this, whatever, the Wall Street this and that, it could have been done. But they managed to circle that square. They ended up creating fascism as a byproduct, and we're living in the world that we're living in now. But now these times are returning. We do see that these wars are happening. They're making another risk. And it is, I think, partially based on this soft power or Noopolitik based thing. But they're making a risk. I think the part that for me that I'm just repeating to myself, because this shit is scary. I want to have like sort of a human admission of this is pissing my pants level stuff. If you really think about the fuckery of people willing to bet our lives on their ideal outcome, right? Because at the end of the day, they're not willing to talk it out. Part of our idea is that humanity can maybe find a way of talking it out and leaving it there, right, between itself. That's, I think, part of our concept. And at the end of the day, the powers that be, all that idea can ever be for them is a tool. All that this idea that people can cooperate and work together, it's going to be a tool. They want to be the last ones left. That's not a product of cooperation. They might have co-opted cooperation, but they want elimination. They want competition to the core, which is the only reason why they would even criticalize things to the level of needing another global war. And when the global war comes, and it is coming, I just hope that we do not lose faith. That is actually the moment where we have to rise up the most. Things become chaotic. We may be jailed. It doesn't matter. They will still need to kill us physically in order for them to stop us. And I think that will be a lot harder during a period of global war where they're too busy killing each other. So, and maybe that's too much for me to say on that level, but that is what I feel like what I have to respond to when it comes to these questions. Because Watchmen, I know it very well. I know the graphic novel better than the movie, actually. I'm like, I guess people know the movie, but I know the graphic novel. For me, where Dr. Manhattan, it's not that because Dr. Manhattan is God and he realizes that, oh, this is the right way. I would say it's actually the fact that he's still human. He's in denial about the fact that he's still. Why does he have a human form? At the end, he just pieces out. He basically suicides. But he is still human, and the human part of him wants to believe that the lie has to be maintained. But nowhere in the story is that actually true. All you need to do in that story is to suppose that these people, who, by the way, have been pointed out to us as being pathetic. The owl guy, he's sad. He's not a leader. He's never had the courage of his convictions. He always had to deal with the comedian's bullshit. The comedian is the only one that even gets close to having an actual moment against the system, but he's too fucked by his own actions in support of the system. For me, the moral lesson here is, again, to remember that when that moment comes, as you say, Kenny, when that real shit comes, you really have to act the correct way. And that moment is an opportunity to act. We're not hopeless. As long as we have breath, as long as we have the ability to act during a chaotic moment, there is a hope for those of us that want to create a world beyond oppression, a world beyond lies and exploitation, because I need to remind myself of that as I'm surrounded by all this apocalyptic bullshit. So
I guess, if we're going to wrap up, I would just sort of describe what I think are the main four scenarios that they have on the table. And I sort of gleaned some of this from, you sent me a video, or it's an audio. It's from the Lindisfarne tapes. The Lindisfarne Association is in 1970, early 70s, I think 70, 71, 72. There was a speech by Jonas Salk, friends with Barbara Marx Hubbard. She called him her kindred spirit. And also speaking there is he's part of the Macy's Cybernetics conferences, Gregory Bateson. Okay, and the speech is titled, or the conference is titled, "Conscious Evolution and the Evolution of Consciousness," and it's prefaced with the host, MC, whatever you want to call him. And he sort of starts with this premise, or posits these possibilities, and he says one of them is that can we escape a scenario in which, and they talk about systems dynamics. I mean, they use all the buzzwords in this, just so you know, okay? But in here he says, is it possible to avoid a scenario in which the military-industrial complex exploits crises to maintain power? Or, this is one view, he says, or in another view is a scenario in which what they call sort of these rogue networks of non-state actors, what he calls the ungovernable, that don't want to go along with the Noopolitik, that they'll create these little pockets of terrorism, and there'll be this stalemate between the oligarchs, the technocrats, and these ungovernable peoples. Those are the intermediaries. So ideal scenario is, right, everybody shuts up and agrees that the Rand Corporation is great, and that we're all one global village, and we're all gods in the Noosphere. The worst case scenario is all out war, right? Escalating, climaxing to all out nuclear war, but some conflagration on a global scale, which I don't think anybody ultimately wants, because you usually, it would be a Pyrrhic victory even if you win, right? I mean, you're going to lose a lot of your infrastructure, you're going to lose a lot of stuff, whether you're China, Russia, the United States, the EU, etc. And then in between those two, the ideal and the worst case scenario is what I just described. One in which the crises are just constantly manipulated and exploited so that the oligarch can maintain power. So there's not really, it's sort of a mixture of the Noopolitik and the real politic. It's kind of like that. It's like a repeated ending to Watchmen. Every couple months, a new crisis, right? And to mind war the people. And then the other one is sort of a stalemate that really is ultimately the crux of it is real politic, is hard power both ways, right? It's just this constant struggle to get these ungovernable people to acquiesce to the panopticon or whatever. The one other thing that I would kind of note to sort of maybe reinforce some of my analysis would be that, okay, there is something called the Office of Net Assessment. Probably never heard of it. It's an agency. The head of the Office of Net Assessment basically is debriefed by all the various branches of the military, also intelligence agencies, right? And they're going to be debriefed, right? In other words, they're going to analyze all the data and all of the information warfare, cyber warfare, scenario planning that they have. And this Office of Net Assessment is pretty much going to be sort of in charge of the systems of systems that sort of, through that debriefing, through that data collection, can be sort of the grand strategist, or the central node by which it can coordinate all these different divisions and agencies. And the way that the existence of this office reinforces my point, or my analysis, that is that the guy that was the first director of the Office of Net Assessment was Andrew Marshall. They put him in charge under Nixon. He was in charge from Nixon, then he was in charge under Ford, then he was in charge under Carter, then he was in charge under Reagan, then he was in charge under H.W. Bush, then he was in charge under Clinton, then he was in charge under W. Bush, and then he was in charge under Barack Obama. The same dude, the head of the Office of Net Assessment, 8 administrations from 1973 to 2015. Like that, you know.
And he died basically.
Yeah, he died. He probably, like I said, he'd probably still be there if he didn't die however many years later. And then there's only been one other dude since him, and he's been the same dude for Obama and Trump. Okay, so I mean, just think of the differences in policy from administration to administration. Then think of the difference in geopolitics for foreign relations under these different administrations. All the different, and you got one dude that's in charge of the Office of Net Assessment that's being debriefed and basically coordinating, right? Like, you would think that if there was a legit changing of the guard and a changing of policy and a changing of relations with these other nations, that the dude that's in charge of all that information, all that data, all these military agencies would change with at least one or two of them.
Right.
You would think.
People would say, "You're out now. I want to put a new guy in who goes my way." Right.
So it suggests that whatever is the grand strategy of the military-industrial complex, that the epicenter of that is your Office of Net Assessment. It's your net-centric warfare, and it suggests that it's a continuity of agenda that is flexible because of the scenario planning model. That you can have the same guy in charge because he's looking at, okay, we're here now. He's just looking at the coordinates. It's not like, oh, we're doing scenario C. Get Marshall out of there. Marshall's going to coordinate whichever scenario we're moving towards, and he's going to steer us one way or the other. So that would be the last thing I would touch on. There was some other interesting little connections between Hubbard and Rockefeller and some things in the document, but that's a good place to stop it.
Are you sure that guy passed away? He doesn't live in a computer somewhere?
He's the first guy to get uploaded into the cloud with he's the first guy to get
him and Kissinger
full consciousness.
I mean, he paid his dues, man. Like, come on.
Plus, to see this list of presidents is pretty interesting.
That was the other thing I wanted to. So just one more thing.
And some of these are 8-year presidents, right? Because it's not.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the guy that wrote the Noopolitik document, the ones that we're looking at, John Arkia is one of the authors. There's a Foreign Policy magazine. He got a whole article how Andrew Marshall helped shape our world. He was like a huge devotee of Marshall.
The title of it is Civil Savant.
And there's a few other ones. There's an MIT article written by Arkia where he has many nice things to say about Marshall. So it's just another more overlap between these Noopolitik people at RAND and the net-centric war people in the Office of Net Assessment.
Maybe we'll leave it at that. First off, Alex, you gave me a lot to think about. I've never really thought about what you said about World War I and World War II. And that actually makes a lot of sense to me. And as always, Jake, you have a lot of new facts that I don't know, that I have to fucking figure out how to make sense of these things. I very much appreciate that. But mostly I appreciate having you here, right? That's that. I'm very excited about that. So I think we'll leave it at that. And we'll figure out where to take our next episode, whether you're part of that or in the future and things like that. And just to let people know, Jake had a very successful trip in Moldova with your conference and things like that.
And so
it didn't take your passport, so I'm glad you're back home.
But y'all helped me practice that stuff.
Right. He was able to take a 2-hour episode and condense it down to 15 minutes.
Yeah, I went to job a day or two later, and while I was jogging, it clicked. I was like, you got to do it totally backwards. It was like, well, the way I did it when I talked to you, I was like, oh, wait, start from specific to general, not general to specific. Yeah, anyway, so thank you. That's helpful.
The mind of a revolutionary.
And if you can send us that link maybe to that conversation or that presentation.
Yeah, I'll put it on the episode because I think it's worth, if you want a condensed version of what he was talking about, possibly even given in a better way, then this would be worth hearing.
It's only 15 minutes.
You don't have to listen to the 2-hour What's Left episode. All right. Well, again, thank you, Jake. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Kenny. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel, challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, and on our blog, what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to the podcast there and connect with us. I remind people, if you like anything you've heard, You can subscribe. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our 8 platforms: Spotify, iTunes, BitChute, Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, or Telegram. Google Play is no longer one. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. Also, I want to wish Eduardo safe travels and look forward to seeing him next week. So that's it. Goodbye, everyone, and we'll see you next week.